Fat loss hierarchy. What matters the most for fat loss? Today, we're going to break down what exactly you need to focus on if you want to get strong, lean, and jacked, and what actually matters. Because a lot of people get confused with all the conflicting information that is out there in the world regarding fat loss. And I don't blame you if that's you, right? Every time you see something brand new, there's like, hey, you know what? A new study that means if you go low carbohydrate, it's better for fat loss. You should avoid insulin at all costs, or you need this one weird trick or supplement that's going to make all the difference. The reality is, everything that we know about health and fitness is built on foundational pillars. And when you understand these basic pillars and principles, you can start to see through all the bullshit, all the random stuff that's on social media and get a clear-cut picture on what actually works, but more importantly, why it works. When you understand why different things work in terms of diet, training, nutritional protocols, it gives you that ability not only to have a great BS detector, but to be able to pivot, to make adjustments, to find that sustainable long-term approach so you can look great naked without living in the gym. Now, if you were checking this out on YouTube right now, you're going to see a graphic, which is our fat loss hierarchy. On the bottom, to explain it, we have the calorie deficit. Next, we have food quality, consistency, and then the triangle gets a little bit more narrow. Then we have our macronutrient split, meal timing, and supplements. And what this visual really does, that highlights that we have a foundational component when it comes to maximizing our body composition for fat loss. It means we need to focus first on A, creating a calorie deficit, B, having good quality food, and C, having consistency in eating these quality foods and at a calorie deficit if we want to lose fat. And so where a lot of people get confused is they see a social media post that might highlight some supplement, or they highlight a particular type of meal timing. For example, only using intermittent fasting or eating 6 meals per day. Or they focus on, hey, I just need to have or avoid carbohydrates and all of a sudden all my problems are going to be cured. When the reality is all of these different components that we see, supplements, meal timing, micronutrient balance, macronutrient balance, so the amount of protein, carbs, and fats we have, are all secondary to being able to create a calorie deficit, having quality food, and being consistent in these key factors. And that's what's so important, because if we start to focus on all these little details, instead of focusing on the underlying principle first, we end up feeling like we're gaining a lot of knowledge and doing a lot of things correctly. But because we're missing that foundational piece, we're not really going to get the results that we're looking for. So what I'm going to do is break down each one of these components and highlight the things that are going to be most important. So not only can you lose body fat, look great naked, do all that stuff, but you build that BS detector so you are in a much better position for the long term. Because ultimately, as a coach, like my mission, my goal is to help you build that sustainable long-term approach so you can look great naked without living in the gym. Here's what we need to understand. Calories are king. And a lot of times we see this battle between, is it calories, is it hormones? And it's not one or the other. It's understanding that both of these things work together. As an example, if your hormones are completely out of whack, you have disrupted thyroid function, testosterone's all over the map, insulin sensitivity, it's going to change how well your body goes to the different nutrients that you have. As an example, if you have somebody who has chronically dieted with crash diets for months and for years, they might go onto a calorie calculator online and see, hey, this says I should be having 2,000 calories per day. When the reality is they've been eating 1,300 calories per day for the last year. If they increase their calories by 700, there's no way that they are going to probably lose that body fat, right? The reality is your metabolism works like a thermostat. It goes up when you consume more food, it goes down when you consume less. And so while calories are king, there's a lot of nuance that has to be applied in saying this key understanding and principle, because metabolic function changes with all these different factors that we have going on in our lives. And so when we look at things like a calorie calculator that you can find online that gives you a good baseline in terms of how many calories you should be having, these are all done with the idea that the person putting these calculations is in a metabolically healthy position. And this is where a lot of people get confused and they feel that, hey, Eric, I tracked my calories and it didn't work. Well, the reality is the things that you've done beforehand play a role in what your actual calorie maintenance is. But what we do know is when it comes to calories, the only way you know you're in a calorie deficit is if you're actually losing body fat. Depending on the number of calories that you're having, you could have some down regulation components that have gone on directly with your diet that makes it harder for you to lose body fat based on what you've done previously. And that's why every calorie estimation is going to be a jumping off point. Why AI, why just doing these online calculators is not going to be able to replace the skill of a coach who's going to be able to factor in and troubleshoot all these different things that have been going on directly in your life. So what I want you to understand here, a couple of different laws. And when you can start to understand these laws, understanding where calories are the foundational component when it comes to being able to change your body is absolutely crucial. It becomes a little bit more clear. And so the first one is what we call the law of metabolic compensation. If you eat less and you exercise more, yes, you can easily create a calorie deficit. Common sense, right? But you can also create an unbalanced metabolism. And this is actually one of the most well understood and least controversial aspects of weight loss research. When you eat less, you are going to naturally naturally get hungry. When you exercise more, you are going to get hungry. You're going to develop cravings. Cortisol, body's primary stress hormone, is often going to increase to a small extent. Depending on what else is going on, it could be a big extent. So if you exercise a ton and eat a lot less to an extreme, your motivation goes out the window, your energy is zapped, your cravings go up very high. And so what happens here, because this metabolic compensation that occurs, we start to stack the deck against ourselves. And pretty soon, we're less motivated, we have less energy, and we have a lot of cravings. And so what do people naturally do? They start to move less. They start to fidget quite a bit less throughout the day. Maybe they take fewer steps. They don't exercise quite as often. And cravings go up. And when cravings go up for most people, what happens? Cravings win. They've got a really damn good winning percentage, right? And so we have to understand that, yes, in a way, is losing body fat as simple as move more and eat less? To an extent, yeah, but there's a lot of nuance that has to be applied. And so when this occurs, in addition to some adaptive thermogenic responses, such as downregulation of thyroid because we have fewer calories, there's a lot of variability in compensation that happens at the human metabolic level that can make what was a calorie deficit before for you not a calorie deficit now based on the steps that you've taken. The second thing we want to understand here is what we call the law of metabolic multitasking. And this means that the body's not a great multitasking. Really, at one point in time, right? Your body's either in an anabolic, a building state, or a catabolic, burning state. So it's either burning or building at any given time, but not both. Where a lot of people get stuck is they focus, hey, I want to build muscle this day, then lose fat this day. And they start to go back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. And really what this does is it doesn't give your body a great chance to really rev up some of this metabolic machinery. You're going to lose fat exponentially faster when you commit fully on to losing body fat. And you put everything in that direction and angle, you put all the ships in the same direction and go with the wind, right? Otherwise, what happens is we're sending our body so many different signals. We upregulate one process, we downregulate another, and pretty soon our cravings all over the map as well, and we're not able to stay consistent. And so what we want to be able to understand here is like metabolic multitasking essentially means if we can focus on one particular body composition goal at a time, we're going to be exponentially faster. Because in the beginning, where a lot of people get confused is like when you start training or when you start training correctly and start eating correctly and you dial in your recovery, a lot of people will actually lose fat and build muscle at the same time. This happens in beginners. It's simply because your body is not in very good shape at this point. Or when people are using anabolics, they start to build lean muscle and lose body fat because they've got the additional benefits of anabolic steroids, right? Well, when people have this same expectation that they're going to make the same progress that they would when they first get started, it really skews their expectation or their belief in different processes when results inevitably slow down. And this becomes a big issue because a lot of people will say, I'm going to lose fat and build muscle. They actually lose fat and build muscle in the beginning, but then they never pivot to one of these goals more specifically and commit fully to making it happen. And so what happens is people get in decent shape and then they don't really progress at all from there, despite doing a lot of things that are quote unquote right, and just end up getting a little bit more frustrated. And so building on this idea, what we have to consider is, and this really ties into the calorie argument, the idea that excess calories always lead to fat isn't necessarily true. And calorie addiction always leads to fat loss is not always necessarily accurate either. Sometimes we do have that recomposition effect, which makes this a little bit more confusing, right? So for example, like you can reduce calories and lose fat, but that weight may or not be body fat. For example, if your protein intake is too low and you've reduced calories, well, guess what? You're going to lose lean tissue, which means your metabolic function is actually going to slow down further. That's not going to be great, right? Conversely, if you create a calorie surplus, but you do it because you've increased protein after eating a lower protein diet, guess what? You might be in a calorie surplus, but you're building lean tissue and actually getting a little bit leaner, in part because the importance of nutrient timing. And in addition to that, the fact that it's almost impossible for your body to store protein as body fat. So we can start to build some lean tissue, and we burn through about 30% of the calories that we consume with protein directly through breaking down protein into amino acids. It's a very difficult digestive process for our body. And so as you can see, there's a lot of nuance that starts to really come into play here. And when we start to understand that there are these unique metabolic components that people have individually, and it's important to understand how well we do each of these tasks and understand where we came from, then it starts to become a little bit more clear on like, okay, these are the things I need to focus on, and it's going to provide a little bit more help. What we got to consider here is like you could be gaining lean tissue, you could be losing lean tissue, depending on things like your protein intake, your consistency, and your training, and how important the interrelation all of these factors are. And this is why there's a lot of disagreement in the fitness industry, because people will cherry pick one piece of research, one particular type of diet, and say this worked for me, it's going to work for you directly, without actually explaining the principles that underpin the entire thing. And so what do we need to understand here? If we truly want to lose body fat, we need to create a consistent long-term calorie deficit in order to get there. But in order to make sure that we are losing body fat, we have to make sure we're having adequate protein intake and we're staying consistent across the board. And the consistency component is where a lot of people really start to struggle because, for example, let's say you're dialed in, you're eating the right amount of protein, you've got the calorie deficit, you've got the right training dialed in, and you're sleeping well, but you only do these things together 4 days out of 7 every single week. So you're dialed in Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. Friday comes along, couple drinks. Saturday, couple drinks, crappy sleep, skip a workout. Sunday, maybe, again, crappy sleep, you didn't train, whatever. Well, we can't expect A or B level results if we are dialed in 4 days out of 7. 4 out of 7 is a 57%. When I was in school, we didn't grade it in curve. That was an F. We have to be brutally honest with ourselves. Are we dialed in 4 days out of 7? Are we dialed in 5 days out of 7? Is it 6? Is it 7? Because we can't expect A or B level results with a F, with a D, with C level implementation. And so where a lot of people fall apart is obviously on the weekend component, they think that they're doing really well because they're dialed in Monday through Thursday, Monday through Friday, but because they blow everything out of the water to such an extent on Saturday and Sunday, they're not making progress. And so if you want to be able to really dial in, make much faster fat loss progress, understanding the fat loss hierarchy and how important consistency is going to be plays a huge, huge role. Finally, we have that food quality component when we're talking about the foundational piece of the fat loss hierarchy. Across the board, if we look at most diets that work, why do they work? Well, they create a calorie deficit. Yeah, that's obviously a huge piece because they restrict some component. Intermittent fasting restricts the time duration, therefore making it harder to overeat. Ketogenic diet restricts the foods that you're eating in terms of carbohydrates, easier to create a calorie deficit. A high carb, low fat approach restricts fat, which allows you to create a calorie deficit. Zone diet, eat certain amount of foods to create a calorie deficit, so on and so forth. So that's one big thing to understand. But if we look at most diets, the ones that are most successful consistently over time, they focus primarily on having lean protein and plants. You want to have foods that came from the ground or had a face. The reason is when we have these foods that are minimally processed, they're high quality, they're going to have more micronutrients. So that's vitamins, minerals, antioxidants, all of that great stuff in fewer calories. In addition, they're going to have a better macronutrient split, meaning higher levels of protein, higher levels of fiber, so to support the carbohydrate aspect, and good quality fats, while having fewer calories than highly processed, highly palatable foods. Finally, the foods that we see that are often created in a lab are going to be designed primarily for mass consumption, not your health. It's a lot easier to dramatically overeat a couple thousand calories worth of Doritos, chips, ice cream, all of that stuff than it is broccoli and steak, right? And so we have to understand that our stomach gets full based on volume. It doesn't get full based on calories. And so if we focus our diet on consuming foods that are high in micronutrients, have great macronutrients, and they take up a lot of space in our stomach but have fewer calories, they're going to be a better option than foods that have a ton of fat, a ton of sodium, that have a ton of refined sugars that don't pack any nutritional load, but are very high in calories and don't fill us up. That's where a lot of people get stuck. And it's not that you can't enjoy some of these foods. You can enjoy anything within reason, but if you're not paying attention to the overall calorie intake of it, that's where you run into issues. So when it comes to food quality, obviously things are expensive. Inflation has made eating healthier a bit more expensive, but ultimately we have to view the food quality that we have as an investment in your health, because we either invest in having good quality food and making the right choices for our health now and for the future, or we're forced to be reactive later when we're overweight, when we are struggling with the way that we look, when we are struggling with a lipid profile that is, knocking your cardiologist over, right? These are all things we have to consider. So while food might be expensive, it might feel more expensive to eat healthier now. Well, first, you're going to look, feel, and perform better, which is going to allow you to look, feel, and perform better in your job, which can help you make more money. But the investment that you're making now in your health to making these better choices with your food can do a number in terms of preventing long-term health costs, which is going to help you obviously in the long term financially. The next big pillar in the fat loss hierarchy, what actually matters for getting jacked, for getting lean, is low carb versus high carb. And so we've got a study over on the other screen right here. It's called The Effect of Low Carbohydrate Diets versus Low Carbohydrate, High Fat Diets on Weight, Blood Pressure, Liquids, Lipids, and Blood Glucose. Is a systematic meta-analysis from the European Journal of Clinical Nutrition. So a meta-analysis is a study of studies. So some very smart people take this study, this study, this study, this study, and they look at all the studies, all the findings, and then they put one giant study together and they summarize all of it. Because if we look at individual studies, and this is what a lot of charlatans in the fitness industry will do, and frankly, a lot of supplement companies, they will cherry pick one study and they will pretend that this is gospel. This one weird thing makes all the difference. When the reality is you can find a study to reinforce and back up any damn point that you want. And that's why a meta-analysis is really helpful, and finding what are the common threads, what actually matters. And so what did this particular study find, and what have many other meta-analyses find? That a lower carbohydrate diet might create a larger change when it comes to weight loss, but not necessarily fat loss. And the big difference here is water weight is going to play a big role here. And so what happens, every gram of carbohydrate can store 4 grams of water. So naturally, when carbohydrate intake is a little bit higher, we store more water directly within our tissues. This is a good thing if you train hard. This is a really good thing, right? Like when we store that glucose, we have that additional water that allows the cells to be better at more or less like taking different nutrients in, nutrient transport in and out, and improving performance because we have more stored carbohydrates and energy within our tissue. This is a good thing, right? Like I want my biceps to have plenty of glucose. 1, because they look better when they're pumped up. And 2, I can train them harder and harder and harder. So people act like water weight's a bad thing. It's not. We're mostly water. And based on this research, they found between the two groups, changes in lean mass, fat mass, blood pressure, triglycerides, and glucose were non-significant. So even if, for example, you lose a little bit more weight with a low carbohydrate diet, it's non-significant, meaning we're talking like fractions of a pound to actually make a difference here. Personally, look, I've gotten completely shredded, veins in my abs, all that fun stuff on a diet that was more or less like 50 grams of carbohydrates at the end. And I've also done it when I'm at 300 grams of carbohydrates in a day, right? And so both of these things can work. It really comes down to a personal preference. One of the issues that people run into when it comes to low carb diets and fat loss is their performance goes down faster. They lose a little bit more lean muscle. And in addition, sleep quality goes down because when we have adequate carbohydrates, it also supports serotonin production, allows us to relax at night, which is one reason that people kind of crave carbohydrates when they're stressed out. And so what we need to understand here is low carb versus high carb doesn't make a big difference as long as we control for our protein and we can control for our calories. The big nuance and the perspective that people need to have here is the more intense you're training. So if you're doing more interval training, if you're doing more weight training, then a approach where you can have more carbohydrates, especially around that workout time, is going to be crucial for you to be able to optimize muscle retention, which therefore supports better fat loss because muscle is the most metabolically active tissue in your body, and better performance, and frankly, better mood. Now, can you do something high fat? Of course. And will you look a little bit drier? Of course, yes, you can. But I think what happens a lot of times is people conflate like a finishing diet. So like what people do to cut water weight for, say, like going on a UFC card or for a photo shoot as what people do primarily to lose body fat. The reality is people with the best physiques in the world, even if they're stepping on stage and they're getting really shredded for an event, they typically keep carbohydrates pretty high until the last, frankly, 7 to 21 days. And at that point is when they start to cut the carbohydrates down because they're worried about the water retention component. Whereas people, when they stay on a prolonged low carbohydrate diet for a long period of time and they're not paying attention to these other factors like their training, nutrition, sometimes we actually see issues in terms of thyroid function because we optimally will use glucose carbohydrates to use inactive thyroid to active thyroid. T3 to T4 conversion is what it's called. Again, this comes down to personal preference, low carb versus high carb. But my recommendation is if you're going to have more weight training, more high intensity activity, and you struggle with stress, anxiety, and sleep, and you want to be able to perform your best and stay in a better mood, a higher carbohydrate approach is going to be better. And if you want to do kind of a water cut and get really shredded towards the very end of a cut, then you can look at manipulating carbohydrates, bringing them very low, and you will get that kind of dried out, cover model look, if you may. But most people don't really ever get there. Next up is micronutrient balance, or micronutrients. These are all the vitamins and minerals that we have inside of our body. Now, we have to think, these are what trigger different chemical reactions, right? And if we can't trigger chemical reactions inside of our body to perform certain duties, then our body's not going to be able to perform the way that it wants. And so it's crucial if we're eating a calorie depleted diet in order to lose body fat, that we are focused on having good quality foods, which kind of goes back to the food quality component that I talked about with minimally processed foods. But we also might want to look at something, and this ties into the top of the pyramid, supplements, even things like a multivitamin, right? Like when we're dieting down, if we do not have adequate levels of B-level vitamins, that's going to negatively impact thyroid function. When we are dieting down, our immune system is actually compromised. And so if we're not having vitamin C, zinc, vitamin D, then that can negatively impact our overall immune system. We can get sick and that can knock you off track. In addition, other things, magnesium. Magnesium is the second most common vitamin and mineral deficiency in the Western world after vitamin D. And so when we don't have adequate levels of magnesium, this impacts over 200 different chemical reactions inside of our body. And some of those are related to stress management, but also glucose tolerance. So how well we handle carbohydrates. And so magnesium supplementation is something that's very important if we're not getting enough directly in the foods that we are eating. right? So you can start to see that there's an interplay between a few of these different things in a nutritional hierarchy. And so that's one thing I want you to pay attention to. One, eat as many minimally processed foods as we can, and then we want to strategically supplement to fill any of those imbalances. Now we're getting close to the top of the pyramid. Again, if you're watching this directly on YouTube, this is the second from the very top, so it's getting smaller and smaller, is meal timing. So of course, meal timing doesn't matter. It does. But here's the beautiful thing, right? There's a study called The Effectiveness of Time-Restricted Eating with Calorie Restrictions versus Calorie Restrictions for Weight Loss and Health without a time-restricted component. And so what did we find out here? We found out that the results suggest that improvements in terms of biochemical parameters are mainly caused by calorie restriction, not by time-restricted eating. And so what does this tell us? Okay. In this example, it says that the primary benefit that we gain when it comes to losing body fat comes from restricting our calories, not necessarily based on the time duration that we eat. And we've seen this time and time again. You've seen people who can get very lean on 8 meals per day, 4 meals per day, 3 meals per day, 2 meals per day, using different types of fasting diets. And this really highlights the individual component, that the most important factor that we can really focus on is creating that consistent calorie deficit. And then meal timing is more of a matter of preference. But again, like some of these other topics, there's nuance that we need to consider here. And let me break down a few of those things for you. All right. So when it comes to meal timing, of course, there's a huge aspect of personal preference. In my experience, I find a lot of people do very well with something like intermittent fasting. And the reason is when you're using intermittent fasting, we are simply using time as a primary way to control for calorie intake. And so if you're only eating from 12 until 8, you have 2 or 3 meals within that time frame. That's going to allow you to have larger meals within that time frame, but still stay in a calorie deficit. That's one huge benefit. The second benefit can be, let's say you have a busy social life and you tend to have more larger dinners with friends, with family. Maybe you're traveling a lot. That makes it a little bit easier as well. In addition, I find that when people are eating less frequently throughout the day, this starts to build a bit more discipline in their day, which can be incredibly beneficial across the board, and it can help reset hunger signals. You see, our body has different hunger hormones, leptin and ghrelin, that change based on when we consistently eat. And so if your body's used to eating at 6, 9, 12, 3, 6, 9, around those time periods, you're gradually going to have increases in hunger because these hormones are used to upregulating because they're expecting food, right? Well, when we use something like intermittent fasting, what it can do is it can help teach us that hunger is not an emergency, but it can take 7 to 10 days for those hunger signals to really start to reset. And so we have to be cognizant that, like, in the beginning, yeah, you're going to have to be battling hunger a little bit, but that's natural. Like, that's going to happen when it comes to losing body fat. And so when we can gain some of that better control, and in the case of intermittent fasting, if it works better within our lifestyle to eat fewer meals, but larger meals and maybe backload them later in the day, as long as we're creating a calorie deficit, eating good quality food, that's going to be beneficial. But again, there's got to be nuance that's applied here. As an example, if you're somebody who's very high stress, then following an approach that's going to be, for example, like a low carb intermittent fasting approach isn't going to be great because it's literally going to live on stimulants and, frankly, upregulated cortisol in order to be able to get the body that you want. That can have a lot of negative downstream effects. In addition, if you're somebody who's training very hard during this time period, right, or you're only training in the morning, we want to be able to support that training with adequate fuel, with protein and carbohydrates directly around that session. And so it comes down to timing and finding what's best for you. I find that something like intermittent fasting was a lot easier to work well for me when I was in my 20s than it is now in my mid 30s, with a lot more responsibilities that are on my plate. And it works better when, stress, stuff like that is a little bit lower. Now, I find a lot of people can use intermittent fasting as a tool that they use during different time periods, but not something that is like that consistent long-term approach. Whereas I find most people find a lot of sustainability in what I call our 4-4-40 muscle meal method, meaning you're going to have 4 meals per day, about 4 hours apart, and ideally around 40 grams of protein per meal. Now, this protein intake amount can vary based on your size, based on what your goals are. For example, if you're a 120-pound female, you probably don't need 160 grams a day. We could probably have that be 4-4-30. 200-pound guy, maybe you want to go 4-4-50. So it's about aligning kind of those macronutrients and those goals in addition to that. But when we have that consistent meal timing, that's going to allow you to have some control over when your cravings hit and more consistency and energy flow throughout the rest of the day. So the biggest thing to take away from meal timing, as long as you can control for calories, as long as you can stay consistent and you're hitting the other aspects of this fat loss hierarchy, then it doesn't make a big difference. It really comes down to your personal preference. Now, the final component of the fat loss hierarchy is supplementation. Can the right supplements help you lose body fat? They can. But your approach should be a health-focused approach when it comes to supplements. When it comes down to fat burners, the reality is most of them are hyped up stimulants with a shitload of caffeine, and they are going to be things that maybe give you a little bit more energy, and they're going to help you curb cravings. They don't actually increase your metabolic rate, except for maybe a small bump from having high amounts of caffeine, which can upregulate metabolic rate to a small extent. So what we need to understand, like when it comes to supplementation, what we want to do is we want to fill the gaps because we're consuming fewer calories and we're probably not getting as many micronutrients as we want. Then having something like a multivitamin, vitamin D, magnesium, fish oil, this stuff can be very helpful because it attacks the most common vitamin or mineral deficiencies that happen. And so if we can start to supplement intelligently with what we do and have a health focused approach, that's going to play a big difference. In addition, when it comes to getting lean, when it comes to getting shredded, anything that's going to help support better quality and duration of sleep is going to be crucial, because when we sleep is when we know that we are naturally improving all of our hormone levels and supporting the recovery that we need. And finally, if it's going to help you support better training and make it more convenient for you to be able to get the right amount of protein and stick with your calorie allotment, things like a protein powder can play a huge role. For example, a lot of people will overshoot their calories, overshoot their fat specifically, trying to get enough protein because they're not eating lean enough sources of protein. In cases like that, having a protein powder can be very helpful. Or let's say you travel and instead of eating the airport food or eating all out at restaurants, again, having some protein supplementation can be very beneficial. So you can focus on the other areas of the fat loss hierarchy, like a calorie deficit and staying consistent and hitting your macros along the way. So think of supplements as something that supplements dialing in the rest of the fat loss pyramid. And by extension, that is what's going to help you lose fat, look great naked, and do all of those things. So when it comes to fat loss, what we have to remember is that success comes down to the ruthless execution of the basics. There is some nuance that needs to be applied, especially when it comes to the argument between like hormones, when it comes to a calorie deficit, what matters. They impact each other. And so where people really get stuck is trying to ascribe to any one particular diet or method as the best thing, when in reality, the way that I approach my coaching with all my clients is I view myself as a mechanic. Every different diet strategy is a tool, and my job is to understand what tool needs to do what job at what particular time, because it changes. And it changes based on your stress levels, based on your age, based on what you've done previously. And that customized approach is why our clients get such incredible results, not just now, but over the last 15 years. And so if that's something that you're interested in, all you have to do is head to the description below, go to bachperformance.com/coaching and fill out a short application. If you want to reach out on Instagram at bachperformance, just send me a short message that says lean, and I will know exactly what you're talking about. We'll get you dialed in so you can look great naked without living in the gym. Now, if you got value from this, hey, please do me a favor, drop me a 5-star review, drop me a comment, let me know what you like, because your willingness and ability to give us feedback and to share these is what helps us grow and keep all of this free of those annoying ads. And I know you just hit 15-second fast forward on every single time. All right, catch you on the next one. This is Eric Bach signing off. Have a great day. Did you find this helpful? If so, pound that like button and hit subscribe. Now, if you want a free copy of our Chiseled Muscle Cheat Sheet, the no BS way to help you lose body fat and build lean muscle in 90 days, make sure that you go to the description below and download your free copy. Any questions? Drop them in the comments, and can't wait to see you with the next video.